Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رضي الله تعالى عنه وسرر التابعين وعلماء آمنين وآئمة أربع مجتهدين ومقالديهم إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Okay, so we have now reached our next section on the in Umdat'l Bayaan on the times of prayer. And this class should be relatively short because it wasn't actually a planned class to do today. We were actually supposed to take a break after we had finished the section on purity tahara, but mashallah, Allah Ta'ala had different plans. So anyway, Sheikh Uthman dan Fodio Taqaddamallahi bi rahmati ameen, he mentions in his Kitabu Ulumul Mu'amilat, right, which you could actually use that text as a commentary to Umdat'l Bayaan. It fills in a lot of missing information of Umdat'l Bayaan. Okay, so he says about the times of prayer, because we're going to be discussing the times of prayer. He says it will be seen from what has preceded that the times of prayer is divided into two parts. The beginning of the time, the ikhtiyara time, which is the best time to do the prayer, the ikhtiyara time, at its chosen time or its earliest time, and the which you have the durori time, the latter time when it is essential that the prayer be prayed to avoid missing the time of prayer altogether, right? And also, what also should be understood with that as well about the times of prayer, you have prayers that when you may miss a prayer, right? There's a thing where you're making up the prayer that you miss, and then also where you're making a prayer that is accepted, right? You're making a prayer that's missing, and you also have a prayer that's accepted. Like, for instance, the person who eats haram food, or also does khamr, right? Intoxicant or whatever. It doesn't matter what type of intoxicant, but an intoxicant. There's narrations that mention that their prayer isn't accepted for 40 days, right? Does that give the person the right to abandon the salat? Say, hey, look, I'm going to take a break. My prayer isn't accepted anyway for 40 days, right? No, that just means that the prayer is not accepted, but however, the obligation of prayer, is still an obligation for you to make the prayer, right? So meaning the prayer won't be accepted as that type of prayer, but however, the prayer is still an obligation upon you. It doesn't mean that you have time off from salah, right? There's no excuses for missing prayer, except in a few cases, and we're going to mention that, right? So he says the latter is when it's essential that the prayer must be prayed in order to missing the time altogether, right? So whoever delays a prayer until the latter time without any excuse has committed a sin. Okay, so you delayed the prayer past its daruri time, its necessary time, you committed an absolute error. But however, the more you delay it, right? It's like when people buy refurbished equipment like electronics, you have different grades of a refurbished electronic. Right? You may have bought it and then be like refurbished grade A, excellent, excellent condition. Meaning like it's almost like new, right? So let's look at the prayer like that. You pray that it's ikhtiyar time, and it's chosen time that it's supposed to be prayed, and you pray as soon as it comes in. That is the top notch. It's like almost like brand new, right? The more you delay it, the grade lowers, right? And then you delay it where it overlaps into the next prayer. Now it's almost like, listen, it got scratches on it, it got dents in it, there's a little small crack in it, right? Although you pray and the prayer will be accepted, it's accepted. However, though, these things, it's got all these things, and you're not as good looking as grade A, right? And this is also understanding where the Prophet ﷺ talks about the looking into the prayer, on the Qiyamah, how Allah Ta'ala will look into the prayer, of the believer. Can the prayer argue on their behalf? So, what type of argument do you think that you will have on the Qiyamah when you're always praying your prayer outside of its proper time, right? What do you think? Prayer strengthens one. It gives one insight, guidance, right? It gives them all of those things. It strengthens them, right? So how much strength do you have? How much of your wilaya, your connection of you being a protected friend of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala relies upon you. This is why we're doing this. It's an obligation that we do it, but it also strengthens our relationship with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. How much of a friend of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala do you think you will be by delaying those things that are obligatory upon you, right? You tarnish, you stain, you destroy, or start beginning to damage that friendship that you have with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Because Allah Ta'ala talks about, you gain wilayah based on you taking care of your obligations, right? So therefore the relationship begins to slip away, begins to slip away. The weaker you get, the further you push yourself away, right? So a person must pray on their prayer, on their time of their prayer at its proper time. And so the Shaykh, he mentions that whoever delays a prayer until the latter time without any excuse has committed a bad deed, right? So a valid excuse for missing a prayer is of the following. One, if a woman is on her mens or she's experiencing postpartum bleeding, which we just spoke about in the last class. Apostasy. Now, apostasy is a serious thing. First of all, you're a Catholic, right? So, I'm saying, most people will do, silly things like this. Like also you hear about people today, it's like today's trend where you have people that'll say, hey, I don't want to be in this marriage no more, so I'm going to apostate, It just don't work that simple, but people do it. So in order for you not to pray, you want to apostate. Honestly, some of our ulama will consider you a non-Muslim if you miss prayer, right? Because what the Prophet say, their proof of based on this is bain a Muslim, bain a kafir, bain a mushrik, right? The difference between a disbeliever and a mushrik, a polytheist, a person who associate gods with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or idol worshiper, right? Is tarkus salat, that he avoids the prayer, right? So here the Prophet ﷺ is saying in this narration that the person is there's no difference between a believer and a disbeliever if he misses prayer. Now, for those who like to say, well, there's ikhtilaf on the issue. Well, the ikhtilaf is this, okay? The only thing that they differ on is that you get clarity about why you missed the prayer, right? You may misunderstood, okay? So instead of giving a general rule, you miss prayer, you're a kafir, we try to find out, what was the reason why you missed the prayer, right? Maybe you misunderstood the time that it came in and you thought you had time, maybe because you're saying that there's excuses. If it was a woman on a mens and someone, sees this woman and she's not praying and you like, yo, you ain't gonna make salat, right? And she like, no. Yeah, you're a Catholic. No, you can't do that. It's not your business whether she's on your mens or not, but you would be concerned, like, yo, you don't hear the adhan and you're not trying to pray, right? So, this kind of person, you show that leeway. You wouldn't just outright, yo, you're a Catholic. So the Sharia, when you're brought before the courts, because it just ain't a thing where you just declare a person a Catholic and you go on about your life and you spread it all over the internet. You're brought to court the same way you'd be brought to court for a DUI, right? And your question about this, how many days has it been, since you didn't pray? The person is given 3 days to repent, right? And then they're executed, because missing prayer is actually a capital punishment. And so when that person dies, they're executed for that. Now your reckoning is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, because death met you, right? A lot of times we do things because we think that death is far away from us, but death is actually nearer than we actually believe. So anyway, so the person's executed, right, as a capital punishment for their prayer. The only thing that the scholars differ on at this point is whether you're getting buried in the cemetery of the Muslims or whether you're getting buried in the cemetery of the Kuffar, right? Avoiding prayer, you don't have no leeway because it's ikhtilaf or whether or not you're considered a kafir or not. So I mentioned that point of apostasy, because sometimes people read books of fiqh and be like, oh, I can apostate and prayer is not obligatory. I don't know why people do these kind of things, but people do it. You have people, they be like, look, I don't want to be in this marriage no more, so I'm just going to denounce my shahada, and then they go on and say brothers be driving women outside of Islam. This is not true. You chose that as your path, right? This isn't true. I don't care how bad life gets, right? That I'll never, inshallah, I'll never choose the path to abandon Islam, no matter how hard life gets for me, right? And that should never be an option for a believer. So anyway, so apostasy, insanity, where a person goes temporary insane, and that's also another thing, to the mental health gurus, that your mental illness is temporary, it's not permanent, right? It stays for a moment. The moment you come out of that state, right, and you're talking about not a state of depression, not a state of anxiety. You're talking about somebody that is literally like Majnun, meaning that they've lost all of their mental faculties, right? Where they're suffering from like psychosis or something, that nature, they're hearing voices or, something like that. Bipolar people can still function, they can still function, being bipolar, they can still function with, everyday, with everyday life by being bipolar, So that's not a thing that would qualify you as being uh, insane. Insane is like something where it overtakes your mind. Um, I think that's the best way I can put it into words to explain. Uh, a person that faints or passes out, at that time, salat is not mandatory upon them because they're not in a state of consciousness, right? When they come back to consciousness, then prayer is obligatory on them. A person that's asleep, right? Now, this doesn't mean that I go to sleep and I intend to sleep through Fajr, because you already made your intention to sleep through Fajr or whatever prayer was, you're guilty, right? But more so like, let me take a nap between this time and this time. Inshallah, I'll wake up for the next salat. And you may have slept a little too long and you woke up either at the end or maybe the next prayer. So, that's when it's not considered missing the prayer, but you would still have to make up that prayer that you slept through, right? A child that's not has not reached puberty yet, right? If you haven't reached puberty, then the obligation of prayer isn't upon you. Although you're instructed to teach the children how to pray at 7 and order them to pray by 10, because by 10 that's the borderline. Those ages between 7 and 10 is the borderline, the beginning of where they start to meet adulthood, right? So from that point on, even if have so acting out of what the Prophet Sallallahu mentioned about instructing them to pray at 10, it's preparing them to when adolescence or adulthood hits them, they're not going to be a stranger to it. Sometimes when you're not prepping a child, they stay in this a childish kind of silly mind state, if for lack of better words. And that's not as an insult, more so as a definition. Where a child is very playful, and they have no consciousness towards the salah, right? And this is like when you have um, a person or a child or a person with a mental impairment, that's one of the signs. When they approach the prayer, they don't see the prayer as something that's obligated, and this is why the Prophet ﷺ said the pen is lifted, in a couple cases, and one of them is when a person doesn't have the mental faculties. The pen is lifted for that person, right? But however, the thing is, and how we treat our people that's mentally impaired, and I'm talking about just America in general, not Muslims. You know, mentally impaired people, sometimes they don't have guardians for them. They don't have nobody that accounts on their, on their behalf, that's responsible for them. And the most popular case of responsibility for someone that has some kind of mental impairment is usually their proxy, so they can sign over for their check. That's usually the number one cause of having a proxy, for someone with a mental illness. So anyway, to make a long story, bring the point back. When a child hasn't reached puberty, even like a lot of people, you see people that they push children to lead the prayer, that hasn't reached puberty. Oh, he's memorized the Quran, but he has no understanding, so on and so forth. And there's other narrations as well that also puts about the having understanding of fiqh and so on and so forth as a condition for one to be an imam as well. No. So whoever delays the prayer, besides that, last part, reaching puberty and out of forgetfulness, it is actually possible. I used to always say this. I don't really understand how it's actually possible, but it is actually possible. You could forget that you didn't pray, all right? But once you remember, then you have to. It's like the same thing. Like for instance, right? In our wudu classes, in our classes dealing with tahara, with purity, if a person has forgot to wash his face when he made wudu, and he walks off and he prays the salat, right? Is the prayer valid, right? In essence, no, the prayer is not valid. But let's say the person forgot. So right now he's conducting himself as if the prayer is valid. The moment he remembers that he didn't wash his face in wudu, the prayer has become immediately invalid, right? The hukum, the shari hukum is the prayer is invalid. But if he believed that he did it and he prayed and he continued on, right? And then it hits him, but you didn't wash your face in wudu, then at that moment the prayer becomes invalid. He recognizes it. And if he continues to pray, well, that's a sin because now he's praying without wudu. You see? So these are the reasons, these are the only reasons that one is excused of missing prayer, which I'll get one more recap. Number one is if the person, well, it would be a female in this case, is on her menses or postpartum, right? Apostasy, okay? In a temporary state of insanity, okay? Fainting, if a person passed out. Sleep, right? Like I said, the person ain't intending to sleep, and it had to happen before the time of the prayer came in as well, right? Meaning you went to sleep before, let's say before Asr, right? You say, look, I'm going to take a nap, before Asr, okay? I'm going to take a nap. It's still Dhuhr time, and you slept. You took that nap, but you slept through Asr to Maghrib, and especially right now, this time of the year, when salats are so close together, it's very easy to do. Because Asr come in about, like right now, about in Philadelphia is about 2:30, somewhere around that 2:30ish, and Maghrib is like 4:45. Right? So you like, yo, I just took a nap, and you wake up and it's Maghrib already. You like, yo, what happened, right? So this is what this means. Not the person goes to sleep at Asr, like I'm just going to take a nap and then pray, right? Not saying that you can't do it, but if you take a nap and pray and you sleep till Maghrib, that's a sin because you are awake and cognizant, coherent at the time when you made that decision to pray Asr, okay? So keep in mind, so when you go to sleep, it can't be at the start of the time of prayer. It has to already pray. You had to pray the current prayer already and maybe fell asleep before the next prayer came in and you didn't happen to wake up. Not sleep all the way through it, okay? So that's what I mean by sleep. Not reaching puberty, meaning the person is not has reached adulthood, because puberty is a sign of adulthood, in Islamic practice and culture, and forgetfulness, okay? So now we're going to talk about the times of prayer. Usually when I teach this class and I teach it in person, oftentimes what I try to do is I try to take the students outside. Usually when we had this class, it's always in the afternoon. We take them outside to show them what the time of Dhuhr looks like. And if we're around long enough, we're showing what the time of Asr, how to determine what the time of Asr. Unfortunately, we're doing this online. So the only thing I'm doing is narrating, narrating to you. Now, I want to give you a fun fact, right? It's just a fun fact, if you know, then you know. If you don't know, it's not anything. The first chapter that's in the Muwatta Imam Malik, what does that chapter start off with? Anybody know? The first chapter.
Is it Salah?
You're in the ballpark.
Purification?
Nope.
Okay. Times of prayer.
Times of prayer. Imam Malik starts off with the times of prayer. And because when the time of prayer comes in, that's when purification becomes an obligation. Okay? That's when it becomes an obligation for you to purify yourself, right? It becomes an obligation for you to have wudu. It becomes an obligation for you to have ghusl, right? It becomes an obligation for you to be in tayammum, right? Things of that nature. It becomes an obligation. You can't determine whether you're going to make tayammum or not unless the time of prayer is in, and it obligates you to look for water, right? And then you can't find water, and you make tayammum as an emergency for the fear of missing the prayer, right? But if you find water before the prayer is out, then therefore you have to make wudu and re-pray that salat. This is why fiqh is so important, right? So that's a little fun fact. Imam Malik started off with waqtul salat or al-qutul salat, the times of prayer, right? Versus tahara, purification, right? Versus the ulama, they started out with purification because, you're going into detail about it, and one of the first things of the study is purification because that is one of the conditions, the shurut of salah. It's one of the conditions of the prayer being valid is purification, is purity. All right. Now, so anyway, that was just a little fun fact, a little fun Maliki fact, especially from the Muwatta Imam Malik, So anyway, he says the waqtul mukhtar, right? You have two times of prayer. You have waqtul mukhtar and waqtul dururi, right? Remember, terminology is everything. I said this way back in the beginning of the classes. Go all the way back. I think class 1, I think I mentioned this, that terminology is important. So waqt means time. Mukhtar means the selected time, okay? The selected time of Dhuhr is from the time the sun reaches the meridian until the time the shadow is equal to the length of an object. So time of prayer isn't. You remember the old sundial? Remember the old sundial clocks? We used to have this big thing in the middle, it was like round, and you would tell time. That's where you get the concept of a clock. And the more the shadow moved, that is how you told time. The more the sun moved, it made the shadow because the sun was moving. That's how you came with the whole concept of a clock. Well, kind of like in that same thing, you can tell the time of prayer, right? When it's time for Salatul Dhuhr, there's a point where the time comes and hits the meridian where it is directly over it, and the ulama say the sun is over top of the Kaaba at that time, and then when the sun, the rotation of the earth moves, then the first shadow over that where the sun, because before it reaches the meridian, all the shadows are on the opposite side. Right, all the shadows on the opposite side till it reaches the meridian. All right, if you get a chance, pay attention to it. Right, and at a certain point in time, most people call that noon, like at noon, right? And it reaches that time, and then once it reached that time and it starts to pass, the shadow will go in the opposite direction than it was, and the shadows will gain size, it'll gain length. Okay, it'll gain length. And so he says here that the sun reaches the meridian until when the shadow is equal to the length of an object, meaning the thing that you're measuring the time with. And that can be done with a soda bottle, a stick. You stand it up, stand it up with something where it can stand erect, and you place it at that time of the sun is at the meridian, where you don't see a shadow of a thing, and then just wait patiently as the time moves, you'll start to see the shadows start to grow. It's small, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger. And as he said, the shadow is twice the length of an object. okay, to the yellowing of the sun. All right. So up to that point, once it gets to the yellowing of the sun, meaning because in the that's what they call afternoon, right? When that sun be like real bright, right? The sun be real bright. We don't pay attention to it. To us, the sun is always bright, right? You just like, oh, okay, sun is there. There you go. As long as it's there, and the only time that you know that the sky ain't lit up, but it's covered up, it's covered when it's a cloudy day, but the sky is still bright. If the sun was absolutely missing, it'd be absolute darkness, right? So we don't really pay attention to that kind of stuff all the time. That's really not our twist. But when that sun gets that yellowing, that's the time of I'm sorry, when the object of the length of that thing becomes the length of that object, that's when the time of Vor has ended. Okay, after that. So he says the select time for the Asr prayer is from the time when the shadow is twice the length of an object to the yellowing of the sun, right? Meaning just before Maghrib come in, that time, right? He said the waqtu dururi, the necessary time for both of them, let me pronounce that properly. The necessary time for both of them is up until the time of the sunset, until the time of Maghrib, right? So anytime you pray Dhuhr and Asr after Maghrib, you pray it past this time. It's the Rori time. The Ikhtiyara time is always the best time. So the chosen time for Salatul Dhuhr is from the time the sun reaches meridian and the shadow begins to increase until it reaches the length of the object. So once it reaches the length of the object, right, Asr's in, right? Okay, now the second part where he says the ikhtiyara time is where the shadow is twice the length of the object. This is the time usually you'll find most Hanafis pray. And if you look, and the way to reconcile this, if you go and look in the Muwatta Imam Malik, you'll see that there's two narrations narrating, and it mentions the times for Asr slightly different, right? So it's no big deal, Of course, our practice is we pray, with that first, once the object reaches the length of that thing, and and once it double, it goes over, the size, it gets bigger than the object, right? That is how we interpret that. Okay. The ikhtiyara time for Maghrib prayer is the amount of time in which it can be prayed after its conditions are fulfilled. All right. Maghrib is a very short prayer. It's not as long as the prayer schedules tell you. Maghrib is actually short, honestly. The prayer schedules, you can get a ballpark idea when Salat comes in, but to be honest with you, it's not its true time, right? It's not its true time. We always have this issue, especially with Ramadan, is usually with our community, our Jamaat, where we usually have a different approach towards a prayer schedule. Prayer schedules, we kind of scrutinize it. We eat suhoor. We stop eating earlier than the actual time that's actually listed, because the crazy part is you can take and change the times. It's argument about the calculated time, because prayer schedules are a calculation. It's based on calculation as well. And in Islam, calculation isn't really like the best method that we utilize. It's used, but it's not the determining factor how the Prophet ﷺ did things. People even try to calculate now the months. When the month of Rabi'ul Awwal come in, and this month they calculated, predated. So anyway, so you'll always find this argument and discussion between when you're dealing with the calculation for the times of prayer. You have the Isna time, which is utilized for the North American, and that's usually used off a 15-degree angle. I don't know. I'm just telling you what I learned from my teachers, and I'm just transmitting the same thing. And I actually see the difference. And then you have the rest of the world, which majority of the world is based on an 18-degree angle. There's one that's probably like 18.5, where their time is their variation of time. And then what you see in the calculation, when you compare the two, you'll see that when it comes for Subh or Fajr, as most people know it, when it comes to time for Subh, the 15-degree angle the time, excuse me, the time is actually later for Subh, but the time for Isha is earlier. And then those on the 18-degree angle or 18.5, the time for Subh is actually earlier, but the time for Isha is later. All right, you understand? You know, you can see that by comparing the two when you utilizing the look at the settings on the prayer calculator, basically scheduled prayer thing. So anyway, so the time for Maghrib, it varies according to the time of the year, but the quickest I ever seen Maghrib go out was probably 30 minutes. All right, and usually at our masjid, it's hard. Like a lot of people always ask, yo, what time you guys pray Isha? When they come in, you know, usually we like there long enough. We're there long enough to make the salat, and we wait for the next one, and we make that salat, and then we're gone because, you know, I'm actually we try not to like, you know, drag out the prayers. You know, we just sitting there in between and chilling. Don't get me wrong, we sit there in between and chill, but we try to make sure we make the prayer as quick as early as possible because people have, you know, other obligations. That's one of the things that you find with people not praying in Jamaat frequently is because usually two things. You know, one is the timing. People may be committed to something where they can't get away, maybe like, you know, work or something in that nature. They may be committed to that, or they live too far from the masjid. You know, it's for them to go to the masjid for salah. It's like a journey. So sometimes people, when they go out for salah, they have to, you know, when they come, they stay, right? So, you know, in our basically our decision making, our ijtihad in this matter, we try to pray the salats like as soon as they come in and make it easy for people to return home to their family. If you stay out late, that's on your choice. You know, you can't have your wife angry, you know, with the imam. Like, why you delaying the prayer? You know, my husband need to get home. He been gone since 6 o'clock this morning. He ain't home yet, you know. But anyway, so the time of Maghrib is extremely short. The condition is at sunset. And our sunset isn't the same as the sunset that's given in the general calendar. The general calendar, when they say sunset, is usually talking about like darkness, right? When we say sunset, we're talking about when the sun is down, right? And it's beginning to get dark up to that point that leads to darkness, right? Up to that point that leads to darkness. So once it gets complete darkness, then Isha is on, right? Isha is on. So it says the select time of Isha prayer is from the time when the twilight disappears. You know, that orangeness, right? Up until the first third of the night. Okay, so I'll tell you how to calculate the first third of the night. All right, so let's say roughly we're going to use exaggerated times. Let's say roughly that Maghrib comes in at 5 p.m. Okay, and let's say roughly, whoo, excuse me, y'all. Let's say roughly that Fajr comes in at 5 a.m. Right? I'm not sure. That comes in at 5 a.m. Right? Let's say it roughly comes in at 5 a.m. So what we're going to do, that's 12 hours. And you want to take and divide that 12 hours by 3. Okay? So 12 divided by 3 is 4. Okay? So 4 hours, right? So we're going to count. Maghrib is at 5. 6, 7, 8. 8 o'clock will be considered the beginning of the second third of the night. Okay? You understand that? Because it says from the disappearing of the twilight. So you might want to extend it to 8:30, 9 o'clock. From the time the sun is completely down up until that first third of the night. That is your ikhtiyara time, right? Now, if a person prays after that time, the prayer is still accepted. But remember when I talked about the different grading of the refurbished products, right? You'll be like a grade D, right? If you pray after that first time, that ikhtiyara time. But if you pray at the dorori time, which the dorori time for Isha is up to the appearance of Fajr, right? Up to that time. So therefore, once you get to that time, now your salat is accepted, but that's on trash. Because why? You get credit for praying Isha, but you don't get the top grading. Okay? So delaying prayer is actually a serious matter, right? Sometimes I know people be like, I just pray when I get home. I got too much going on right now. My mind, I can't think straight. And they delay prayer. But the prayer is almost like your report card. It's how you get your grading, for the Qiyamah. So the last thing we mentioned is the time of subh prayer. It's from the first light of dawn, right? Which is that crack of light. You have to really be outside in a good area to see that crack of light, because the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. You'll see there's a distinct look of that darkness. It's still dark outside, but there's that crack of light. It's almost like a light glow, right? It's not when the sun is up, when it's like real light or anything like that, because people misinterpret it wrong. That is the true time of that. That's the true time of subh, right? And he said is dorori time. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Subh is from the first crack of light of dawn up until the glow, right? Meaning now up until that point where the sky is starting to brighten, right? But you can still see that darkness, but it's starting to open up. He says its necessary time is up until the rising of the sun. In all of the above, you have to make up the prayer what's outside of that, right? And like I said, we mentioned in the beginning what Shaykh Uthman and Fodio took out the Malari Rahmati Amin that we opened up when he's talking about this subject. So with that, inshallah, we will close out. All right, there's no questions or comments. We'll move on and conclude class till next week, inshallah. And next week we'll be going over the conditions of prayer. Nah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك واشهد ان لا اله الا انت واستغفر الله واتوب اليك السلام عليكم ورحمه الله وبركاته